I think just about every writer relies very heavily on personal experience, even very obliquely. Even if you're writing a science fiction or a fantasy epic, the characters in that are going to be informed by people you've met and places you've seen, things you've done, things you've read, etc. So the idea of writing something completely divorced from personal experience, just to me, doesn't make much sense. Having said that, I do rely, generally speaking, very heavily on personal experience, but I always try to fictionalise it as much as possible. I think the problem with writing purely personal work is that it can become very difficult to communicate your experience to the reader. I remember as a school teacher, sometimes pupils would write personally, and they would write an essay that, oh, my life's terrible, nobody understands me, everything's so bleak and dark and black. And that's fine. Maybe that person does feel like that. But that sort of thing doesn't necessarily communicate with other people. And that's what writers ought to try to do. Writers ought to set off a little spark in their readers' minds so that readers say, oh yeah, I recognise that. I know what's going on there. And so for me, what I always try to do is try to fictionalise what I've seen and done, etc. For example, there's a story I wrote that's part of my collection called Neighbourly, which was written at the time about my father, who died in 2001. But when I wrote the story, he was suffering from a dementia type illness, and he lived with my mother, who herself was quite old. And when I visited, it was extremely difficult watching the dynamic, watching my father forgetting things from 1 hour to the next or one day to the next, and getting things wrong and getting confused. But what was also really difficult for me was my mother's frustration, watching her unable to cope with the constant confusion that my father was in. Very frustrating for her. And I found it very, very difficult. I found myself not wanting to go and visit my parents, which was a very hurtful thing to realise about myself. And when I wrote Neighbourly, I wrote it about that kind of a relationship. So what I did was I wrote it from the point of view of the mother, because what that allowed me was to try and capture what she was feeling. It wasn't, isn't my family going through a terrible thing at the moment? I put myself in my mother's shoes in order to explore explore the dynamic of the relationship that was going on between my mother and father. And I think a great question to ask yourself is, what if? Let's take an experience I've had and ask myself, what if? What if I look at that from someone else's point of view? What if that happened instead of that happened? So that you fictionalise a personal experience, because I think that by fictionalising a personal experience, you make it much more universal. I think there's a problem too in writing about personal experience, in that people tend to feel that it has to be historically accurate. They don't feel they're doing justice to it unless it's historically accurate. And I would say not to worry about that. For example, if you read the first chapter of Laurie Lee's Cider with Rosie, it's about a family moving home. And it's incredibly detailed, incredibly rich in the senses and in imagery. But it's told from the point of view of Laurie Lee. It's Laurie Lee's autobiography. And at the time, he's a toddler. And so you have to ask yourself, how much did he actually remember? And the answer is very, very little. But that's okay. That's all right. Because the point is not, this is exactly what happened, but this is how I feel about what I remember. These are the impressions I have. These are the emotions that thinking about that creates. So you may have to invent and manipulate and readjust your personal experience in order to communicate those emotions to the reader. Take, for example, write about a time when you were embarrassed. Okay, once upon a time, and this didn't happen to me, once upon a time my swimming trunks fell off, right? Now, let's say that my swimming trunks fell off when I was swimming in the sea off of Marbella, and I came out the water and my mum and dad laughed at me, right? Well, that's okay, but it doesn't really get across the absolute crushing humiliation I felt. So let's take that incident and put it in the school swimming pool, when there are 30 of my classmates round about, when the bully who's been picking on me sees my swimming trunks falling off, when the girl I am madly in love with sees my trunks falling off. That manipulation allows me to take those emotions and make something much more vivid and much more universal of them. And it's still personal writing. I remember an old higher close reading passage a few years ago in which Laurie Lee spoke about autobiography. And he wrote about a story he'd written about a family wedding. And afterwards, he got all sorts of criticism from his family because things were said to him like, you got that all wrong, you got that totally wrong, that wasn't Aunt Beryl's wedding, it was Aunt Enid's. And it's things like that, the concentration on the minutiae that can sometimes spoil a piece of personal writing. And so again, it's about this idea of reinvention, of manipulation.